Hello, my EDCI 5720 friends. This is Patrick Maniak here. Not my long-haired twin brother who you saw in the video in the first module. This is me, real time, and we're going to give a little introduction to the third module, which is focused on RTI structures and processes. Okay? I think it's very notable from the time that I started this module and this focus some 5 or 6 years ago to now, how much has changed in terms of teacher knowledge and school knowledge about RTI. Now it's of course commonplace in our terminology. I don't really need to explain, these multi-tiered levels of intervention or the basics of assessment, progress monitoring, and so forth. I think that's very positive, and I do overall believe that the RTI model is very strong commonsensually. I think in certain instances it's had strong results in terms of research, and even when it doesn't, I still think it represents the best we can do. Typically with kids and populations who are going to struggle. So that said, let me dive into a few key points that I want to make. Some of these are from the very text that you're going to read. For instance, elementary folks reading the O'Connor, the secondary folks reading Pyle and Vaughan. But things I want to highlight, and I'll finish with some big takeaways, Patrick's points with regard to, broader reading and the research in this area. Okay, so of course when we look at RTI in reading, hey, I'd like to have a page up here that says RTI in writing, since we are dealing with literacy difficulties. Unfortunately, I think that's largely a black hole. We simply don't know a lot about writing intervention in general, and specifically, the kind of structures and processes and outcomes for multi-tiered intervention in writing. So we're going to keep our discussion to reading, but of course there's plenty to say about that alone. So we'll dive in. Again, I don't think we need to explain much about what these tiers actually represent. Most of you are now living them and involved in them and so forth. So let me try and point out some of the general perspectives and then some of the outcomes that we know from research. Tier 1, of course, we're talking about general classroom instruction. They tried to designate it as Tier 1 intervention in order to kind of raise the seriousness of classroom instruction, make sure that classroom instruction was more aligned with the research base on sort of what we know works in terms of the various grade levels in reading instruction, and just pull classroom instruction up a notch by calling it Tier 1 intervention. So of course at this level, everyone provides classroom instruction. Whether we would call all of that Tier 1 intervention or not, well, that's kind of semantics. What we have seen in research is that folks like who have researched this in serious ways, Randy O'Connor, Sharon Vaughan, some of the early studies where they went out to real schools and real folks and tried to implement these things, both O'Connor and Vaughan came back and really started their discussion of their research by saying how critical improving Tier 1 instruction, classroom instruction, was to an entire system of intervention. It just is absolutely critical. Of course, it's critical in the sense that you want to move as many kids forward, in a normal band as possible without having to tax intervention programs to do that. Intervention programs, by their very nature, are dealing with higher degrees of intensity, and you can only have that when you have lower numbers of kids involved in them. In theory, the number that is typically held out is that we would like to see 80% of students kind of on grade level in a normal band. Now that doesn't always mean, we usually talk about outcomes in terms of a normal band. So, we're not talking about exactly 50% and up per se, but, maybe it's a 35 percentile and up in terms of of reading achievement to say, okay, they may still be a little bit behind the average or the norm, but we can call them in a normal band. We want to see about 80% of kids moving on. Again, that makes it more realistic to provide higher intensity instruction for 20% of a grade level population. We've all probably seen, I certainly have, our gals from Denver certainly would, schools where this is way out of whack. Visit Wyoming Indian schools, some of the urban schools, some of the South Cheyenne, you're going to see much lower numbers. I can sort of excuse some of that because in tougher circumstances, you're going to have a higher percentage of kids than that traditional 20% who struggle with beginning reading. And so your regular instruction may not get up to 80%, but still I try, and even with the really tough schools that I work with, try and push for, we've got to get up there 70%, 75% of our kids getting, sort of more or less in that normal band through classroom instruction. Otherwise, all we're going to say about more intensive intervention doesn't really make sense. You got 120 kids out of 240 who need intensive intervention. Good luck in sort of having the human resources to meet that need, right? The other reason that this is critical is that RTI instruction, we had this discussion in the first discussion, I think, really should be kind of double dipping. This intervention should be on top of really strong classroom instruction, so that, it takes both of those to then have acceleration in terms of outcomes. And finally, even for kids who are in intervention and respond and rejoin, say, sort of normal band, they have to stay there. And if we don't have really great classroom instruction, the odds may not be great that that's the case. So, even our probably, highest level researchers have just underscored the critical nature of this Tier 1 classroom instruction. So, all right, let's move on and talk about Tier 2 instruction. This, of course, has usually been conceived of as sort of small group intervention. Raise the level of intensity of instruction by reducing the numbers. We've seen 5 to 1, we've seen 10 to 1, 3 to 1. It kind of course, is going to depend on the resources and the context. A couple things that we know from research about Tier 2 instruction is that, number one, it can involve regular classroom materials, Tier 1 materials, and approaches, but just with greater intensity, greater focus on mastery, and so forth. Randy O'Connor's study shows that, where more or less in the Tier 2 groups, the kids are doing the same things that are happening in regular classroom instruction, but just, of course, with greater intensity, and by both having smaller numbers and more extended time. And lo and behold, they had pretty successful results. That's not the only way, of course, to conceive of Tier 2 instruction, but that is something that's been confirmed in research, that, it is okay to use regular materials, core materials, and just, bring it with, more intensity and more attention to mastery. Next thing, and again, those of you in elementary are going to read about this one, is that at least at the kindergarten level, we see that the classroom teacher in that study actually was the one who provided the Tier 2 instruction. And that's, of course, because at kindergarten, we're talking about things like phonemic segmentation and blending, teaching of letter sounds, and maybe just the basics of beginning, blending, or decoding. Those are relatively short interventions, and that it was arranged in that study for the classroom teacher to provide them. And you'll notice in that study, 97 out of 100 of their kids, so 97% of their kids actually did reach the benchmarks in phonemic processing and letter knowledge. So even with a classroom teacher. Again, not that that's the only way, that we would never send an interventionist or a resource teacher or a trained volunteer or someone down to kindergarten, But at least we have one model from research where in kindergarten they got it done within the confines of the classroom. Okay, overall, again, sort of in theory, the goal is that 2/3 of the students who go into Tier 2 instruction should respond in the sense of moving back into a normal band. So, if you're starting to add this up, you go, okay, classroom instruction takes care of 80 out of 100 of our kids. We have 20 that go into Tier 2 intervention, and hopefully about 13, 14 of those kids respond in the sense of, regaining a normal band and exiting Tier 2 intervention. So that takes us up to that 94, 95% of kids get in a normal band as a result of our first 2 tiers of instruction, which of course is a great goal and a great, outcome. We'll look at some cases where that simply wasn't the case. And again, where theory may not match the realities and feasibility in the school. Now, we should point out, though, that even responders, this is not necessarily an inoculation, a fix. You'll see in the O'Connor study, kids who responded to intervention in one grade, say in first grade, who were back in it, maybe by the end of that grade or at least by the next grade in second grade. And I don't think there's any getting around that. This goes back to our first module and some of the issues around either the cognitive or environmental sort of deficits that cause, trouble with reading. They don't go away. And so I think it's a little unrealistic to think in terms of inoculation, that we're going to do something early on to these kids and they're never going to, kind of fall below a normal band again. I simply don't see that as realistic, and I don't see it playing out in practice. Okay, so that's important to remember. Now, again, on the side of realism, study by Gilbert and the Fuchses back at Vanderbilt, some of the real leaders and initiators of this RTI model, they show the limits of short-term intervention. In their study, they intervened in a Tier 2 level for 14 weeks for kids in first grade. Hey, catching them early, that's great. But the reality was, by third grade, only 40% of the kids who received that Tier 2 intervention in first grade were still in a normal band. And I believe they used 30th percentile and up. So 60% of their kids who received that 14-week intervention in first grade were no longer in a normal band by third grade. So, less than half of those kids were sort of prepared for longer-term success in reading. Now, just the kids who responded successfully to that 14-week intervention, well, even only 53% of those responders were still in the normal band at third grade. So a good half of the kids who appeared to respond successfully in first grade to Tier 2 intervention were no longer in a normal band in third grade. They walk away with this sort of healthy sense of kind of realism that, the biggest conclusion was that you cannot view this form of intervention with struggling readers as a short-term sort of prospect. If you're going to give 14 weeks, you're going to get less than half of your kids, in the long term reading proficiently. So I think that's a nice sort of dose of real reality here, that we're involved in a long-term commitment to supporting kids who struggle. All right, let's go on. And now we're looking at Tier 3 intervention. This is, of course, best characterized by this notion of intensive, of truly intensive. Usually more individualized, which is not to say that it has to be one-on-one. We've said before, we've had just as strong of gains in a 3-to-1 student-to-teacher ratio as 1-to-1, really, in interventions, even at this intensive level. But nevertheless, the instruction is more intensive, more time, more frequency, and more individualized, let's say even to a small group's needs. In theory, we have only 5%, 6% of our total population here, right? If we take care of 80%, 2/3 of those last 20 kids in tier 2, we're down to, 5 or 6 kids, which is, if you notice in the O'Connor study, which was done in an urban area in Southern California, not an easy, setting, that's about where they got to. So I think that was pretty positive. Notice that was over several years, however. Now, a few things we know about tier 3 intervention. One is that it simply has not shown across several studies to work to take tier 2 instruction, same materials, same approaches, and just do it with more intensity. Let's say to reduce the group from 6 down to 3 or 6 down to 2, or to go from 3 days a week to 5 days a week. Basically, several studies played with this in terms of a control group in regular tier 2 instruction and a treatment group in tier 3, which was the exact same stuff as tier 2 but with greater intensity, and it basically proved to no additional benefits. So this has to look different now. Kaminui early on, I think a very strong positive chapter, showed that focused tier 3 intervention, by that I mean you take the sort of critical developmental issue for this kid and you say, it's a first grader, not decoding words, well, very hesitating, halting, unsuccessful. We are going to focus on that key developmental issue. The intervention is going to be really built around word recognition. Maybe there's some success there. Okay, now the issue is text reading fluency. We're really going to focus on text reading fluency. So that kind of focus intervention, better than, say, a multi-component intervention early on. So we do a little word rec, a little fluency, little comprehension, little vocabulary, little oral language. Much stronger results from the focused intervention. That shouldn't be surprising. Kids at this level, they need what they need. We really have to hit it hard, right? And not that there's anything wrong with any of those other components, but it just simply then doesn't allow for the focus and the intensity that these kids need for a breakthrough. Now, this may look a little, we're going to hit secondary here in a second, may look a little different at secondary, where the problems might not be so sort of focused in the word recognition, sort of area. You see in the Vaughan work that the recommendation and out of the Hawk study is usually multi-component. Still, practically, I believe the more focused and intensive intervention is, the greater success, the greater chance you're going to have at success. Now, it may be limited success, limited to that component you're focused on, but if it's something like word recognition, guess what? You need success there before you can really, all the other dominoes fall. So I think there's a lot to practically recommend, very focused tier 3 intervention. Let's take one problem, solve it, and then move on. All right, how about secondary? Well, really, we have less research, no surprise there, on RTI processes at secondary. For our secondary folks, you're reading that summary of the Vaughan team studies, which is the best we have in terms of actual empirical research on this. It can be a little more difficult to sort of conceive of what this process and structure looks like at a secondary school. That's why I really recommend the Vaughan study, because that's one group who actually put something practical in place, so you can see kind of how they did it there. I won't go through the details because it's pretty clear. Outcomes, I think I mentioned up front in the first discussion, not wildly optimistic, positive. What we saw is pretty mild benefits for the kids who received this, 1 year of tier 2, another year they called tier 3, another year they called tier 4. Kids sometimes receiving up to 3 years of intervention, in a kind of a specialized reading class. Yes, they showed benefits over control kids who were similar strugglers, who just were in the regular school protocols, but very slim margin of benefit. something like 0.16 effect size, which is a pretty small practical benefit. That's definitely in what we categorize as a mild effect size. I like to look for moderate, if not large, effects when you're investing this much, sort of human resources. And what we see in terms of explaining these benefits, now the kids who stayed in 3 years showed larger effect size benefits over the kids in the control groups. But what was primarily responsible for them was not accelerated growth by the treatment kids, but it was that the control kids' achievement actually declined over time. So, for the most part, this intensive intervention simply allowed a steady positive growth on the side of the strugglers who received it. Whereas other strugglers literally declined in terms of achievement across these years. And this is another critical point. It's one thing to say, the treatment group showed benefits over the control group. It's a different thing to say the treatment group actually caught up to the normal band or the normal achieving students. And that was definitely not the case. Even after 3 years of middle school intervention, what we saw is that the intervention group did not reach the normal band. So if you can see these 3 lines, this basically gives it in a picture what happened. Here's our normal performing students, kind of that steady upward tilt. Here's our treatment students, well below, but showing that sort of parallel positive growth. Never that accelerated growth that would catch them up. And here's our untreated controls, strugglers who weren't in the intervention, who literally decline. That's basically the best we have. And I think it really stresses, not that, there's real benefits to ending up here rather than there. So don't get me wrong. But in terms of hopes of really putting these kids back on a normal performing trajectory, too little, this was a lot. This was 3 years, but definitely too late. Okay, so those are our tiers and secondary issues. I want to conclude with one set of big points that I take from sort of reading a little more broadly in this research. And I do have a doctoral student who's about ready to start an RTI study down in Fort Collins at a very high poverty school that we're kind of excited about. So hopefully we're going to have some data kind of in-house fairly soon. Here's what I take away and what I would communicate to you. First is that there is simply no substitute for excellent classroom instruction. No intervention system will ever sort of overcome lackluster or subpar classroom instruction. It just can't. In fact, as I said during the Tier 1 discussion, the other tiers don't really work unless you have unlimited resources, and if you do, let us know because we all want to be there. They don't really work unless Tier 1 is in place and taking care of that majority of our students. And, on the other end, if we've got some kids who respond to instruction and go back to Tier 1 and it's not exceptional, what are the odds that those kids are going to maintain a normal level of performance? Not very high. It all starts at the classroom level. In the schools that I visit and talk to and counsel, that's usually where we really have to dig in. All right. Next, there's no question that this is start early and keep the, course. In fact, I didn't mention a study that I didn't mention. Randy O'Connor actually sort of looked at whether there was additional benefits for kids starting in kindergarten in, say, a Tier 2 intervention versus first grade. If that early identification and treatment, produced benefits. It definitely did. It pays to start as early as possible, and as we saw from that 14-week study of Gilbert, it takes long-term effort and commitment. Short-term fixes are, there's a book on reading intervention well-known called No Quick Fixes, and that's well-titled. All right, number 3, that intervention is not an inoculation. Even responders to Tier 2 instruction who move back up to a normal band, exit our, intervention groups, you could expect to see some of those again. Whether it's later in the year, the next year, we see it in the O'Connor study. We see it in just about every study. There's some myths around programs like Reading Recovery that I think don't have a lot of research support, that, it's kind of a one-time fix. Very fine scholars like Nicholson and Tunmer down in New Zealand, the mother bed of Reading Recovery, have written about, the vast majority of the kids they see in upper elementary level reading clinics have been in Reading Recovery down in first grade. So, and I mean, it's not a problem with Reading Recovery. It's been a very successful program, or any others. It's the nature of the task and of the deficits. All right. So 4th point is, even if kids don't read, we've been using sort of a normal band, 35 percentile, 30th percentile is kind of the target here, and as the evaluation criteria. I want to stress, though, even when we intervene strongly with kids and they don't reach a normal band, that intervention still matters. I think it came up in the first discussion. It really matters if a kid struggles in reading down here at the 3rd percentile or up here at the 25th percentile. Yeah, they're both strugglers, but not all strugglers are the same. That kid in the 2nd percentile, the whole school day makes no sense for him. He's probably getting no benefits, or she, from regular classroom instruction and grade level texts. This kid at the 25th, 29th percentile, yeah, with some accommodations that a classroom teacher can make, maybe this kid is still benefiting from classroom instruction. So, yes, we want all kids up at that sort of normal band, but it's still it doesn't mean that the intervention didn't matter, if they moved from the 10th to the 25th. That's very significant. All right. 5th point is, the short-term skills from my reading are much better target than long window skills in terms of intervention. I mean, this is just common sensual. By short window skills, I mean those skills that we can, sort of have a finite role to play within the long-term development of proficient reading. Something like phonemic awareness. Critical, but only if you're in kindergarten or first grade. Not particularly significant by the time you're in 7th grade and need to read the social studies book. Those sort of short window skills tend to respond better to intervention, and a shorter term intervention. Phonemic awareness, decoding are excellent examples of that. A long window skill like vocab, I call it long window because it starts basically at birth and it never ends. You and I are still acquiring vocabulary, and it still would make us better readers. It's a long window skill. It grows very incrementally. You can see the shortcomings of a very brief intervention in terms of dealing with a long window skill. Any long window skills, they need to be taught all day, every day, from pre-kindergarten, through college. And so they're not as amenable to sort of focused intervention. So that's something to keep in mind. Finally, Tier T3, as we ended up on the previous page, I think we're always better to have a very focused vision of that. Now, the one place where that may change a little is in secondary, where clearly, kids, a lot of the short window skills are they may be a little weak, but, not, we still have kids who can read words. Now we might have to start working on a couple items simultaneously. But overall, I think if we're going to see benefits, and it's just a matter of intensity, right? If you got a kid who struggles to the level of being in Tier 3 intervention, that's a tough nut to crack, and we have to sort of bring the hammer if it's word recognition, if it's fluency. And that kind of gets diluted if we're trying to do 4 or 5 things in one brief intervention session. Okay, there it is. There's my points. Hopefully this helps. You've got some good reading to do. I think you'll enjoy it. Please remember that the clock is ticking on that first large project, which is that school-wide assessment. If you have questions or concerns about the way that's going for you, you need to get in touch right away. Otherwise, I'll look forward to the discussion, look forward to seeing you on the class website. Thanks. Have a great week.